And you know that behind all these doors, life is happening for people. They have family over. They're celebrating Christmas Eve. They're being pleased and excited by what this time of year means. And I'm walking up and down the corridors by myself. And when I stop and stick my head in, I have to check that my mother's still asleep, because if she gets up, she might go wandering. My mother's memory loss accelerated after my father died. It was the stress, I'm sure. She forgot many times that my father had died. And sometimes we had to tell her all over again. And she had to experience and feel that loss all over again. Nowadays we don't do that. Her memory loss has gotten even worse than that. But at the beginning we had to, because we had to try to talk to her about what we were going to do with her, where she was going to go to live, and what she needed, and how Marty and I, Marty is my brother, were going to take care of her. But this also means that she's no longer company for me. I can't talk with her about stories of when I was growing up. I can't talk with her about stories about Dad and things he did. I can almost sometimes get her to talk about stories about when she was growing up, but she can't keep them organized in her thoughts for more than 3 or 4 sentences at a time. She's no longer any company for me. She's just someone that I have to take care of. And I do, and I care about her, and I still love her, but here I am walking up and down the corridors, and I'm alone. And I try to tell myself things that will help. I say to myself, hey, look, part of the reason we get this problem with so many people having such bad memories at the end of their lives is because we succeeded at living longer. Medicine and the whole community of doctors and caregivers have worked together so we live 10 years longer than we did 100 years ago. 100 years ago, my mom would have died before the memory loss set in of something else, maybe of that bad bowel she had. So, really, I mean, this is a blessing, isn't it? 10 extra years of life and only the last 2 of them are bad. Most of us would make that trade if we were offered that trade when we were 65, wouldn't we? I tell myself that. It's an interesting idea. It helps that much with how I feel. You know, it maybe helps that much with believing that it's okay, but it only helps that much with how I feel. And I'm not getting a lot of company from other people to help with how I feel. Mind you, I do get wishes from other people. I get emails from friends. I get communications that people are praying for me. And that does help. It does help. But late at night, when I'm all alone, when I'm walking up and down the hallways that feels like I'm trapped in some sort of stupid science fiction horror movie, it's not as bad as that, but it feels a little trapped. And I'm realizing that I'm really awfully lonely. The person I'm spending my time with, my own mother, is no relief of loneliness. And I work on sermons while I'm walking. I'm walking up and down the hallways, and the thought strikes me as I realize that what's wrong right now in my feelings is that I'm really, really lonely. I realize God gets lonely too. God gets lonely too. Now, in thinking about sermons, I'm planning for these sermons that I give that become part of our Sunday school lessons. And I know I'm going to be giving sermons this week and next week on the Incarnation and the Trinity. And the Incarnation and the Trinity are ideas that theologians like me, I have a doctorate degree in theology, treat as interesting philosophical and theological problems. How can God become human? How can God be 3 in 1? And there's all sorts of philosophical problems that have to be solved in figuring out how these things can fit together And I'm realizing that that's not what the incarnation is really all about. That may be true stuff about the incarnation and stuff that some people, theologians, need to think about in order to figure out how something like the incarnation affects all of everything. But from where I stand, or from where I walk, up and down the hallways, the real meaning of the incarnation right now is that God gets lonely too. That anything that I feel, anything that I suffer, anything that I have to deal with right now is something that God feels too. That God suffers too. That God also has to deal with too. The incarnation, that God became human, doesn't solve a philosophical problem about how God is going to be related to human beings. It's God getting right inside of our lives. God isn't just up there looking down on us from above. God doesn't just know what our problems are. God doesn't just understand how these poor human beings are partly screwed up from their sins and partly suffering from the oppressions and the sorrows of life. It's no longer something that an infinite God knows as a small part of God's infinite wisdom. Now it's something that God suffers right here with me. The meaning of the incarnation is that God has become one of us and experiences what we experience. The explanations of the incarnation have a whole different purpose. But an explanation isn't the real thing. An explanation is not the real thing, not in science, not in art, not in the practice of medicine. Right? Everything that you're studying for in that test, this is Christine, she's a physical therapist. Everything that she studies for in this test that she's going to take to add another professional qualification, and she's really qualified, is just an explanation. The real thing is when you put your hands on people, isn't it? The real thing is when you put your hands on people. The real thing in the incarnation is when God puts his hands on me. When God experiences and suffers what I suffer too. And the scripture is full of stuff which illustrates that. I want to read one of them now. Now you can back up to the scripture reading. In the 26th chapter of Matthew, you've almost certainly heard this before, starting in the 36th verse. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be grieved and agitated. And then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." And then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray with me that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away for the second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. And then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going." Don't you think that that was a lonely time? Here he took his disciples with him. And here he took the three he was closest to with him. And he said to them, "Stay awake and pray with me." And they fell asleep. And he was facing the greatest crisis of his ministry. The last final place where he had to decide, am I going to go through with this? And what's it going to cost? And how bad is it going to be? And he was praying to God in earnestness, in grief, in sorrow. And they fell asleep. There was no one with him. He was scared and lonely too. He was strong enough to endure the fear and the loneliness, but they were there. They were real. The loneliness was perhaps even more profound on the cross, where at the last moment he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even this separation from God that we know all too well, even we who are in the church, who believe and who have accepted the truth and the reward and the comfort of being God's people, we still know over and over again, all too often in our lives, that feeling of separation from God, that there's no connection, that we want it, we wish for it, we believe that it'll be true somehow, but just right now, it's not there for us. It's just not there for us. And even Jesus Christ, who was God in person, as a human being, also experienced and felt and suffered from that separation from God. That separation from God. This is what the incarnation is really all about. It's that God takes upon himself all that it is to be human, the good and the bad as well. Feels himself, experiences himself, knows himself, and knows not intellectually like I tend to know things, but really, truly, deeply, intimately, personally, knows what it's like to be one of us. And we speak of comfort. And it is a comfort to me as I'm walking up and down the halls, as I'm working on this sermon as I walk, as I'm thinking ahead to next week's sermon. It is a comfort to me, but you have to understand what comfort means. Comfort comes from a Latin word that means with strength. It doesn't mean lessens pain. It doesn't mean anesthetizes pain. It doesn't mean that the sorrow and the suffering go away. It means that God gives us enough strength to carry them. It means that God has experienced these things too and is able to add to us enough maturity, enough understanding of what the world is really like, and enough strength of character and person to be able to endure and to carry these sorrows and these pains. In part and in some way, it may be that we suffer more because of being able to carry that suffering, because of the strength, because of the comfort that God gives us. But that's the good thing about it, even though it sounds bad at first. God is in the business of changing what would otherwise be evil into good. This is a greater thing that God does than he did in creation, making the whole universe out of nothing. A big bang, stars and galaxies, hundreds of billions of galaxies spread across billions of years. That was easy. That was easy because they were made out of nothing, and nothing doesn't resist. Nothing can't resist. It's nothing. But to make good out of evil, to make joy out of sorrow and suffering, to make life out of death, this is hard, even for God. This is so hard, even for God, that in order to do it, God had to become one of us, had to endure what we endure, pain and sorrow and suffering, had to endure death as we ourselves experience it, as a cutting off, as an ending, as a stopping, as a place where something is broken. in order to unbreak it, in order to put it back together. And the resurrection does not erase the crucifixion. We preach them together all the time. The joy that God makes out of this, the life that God makes out of this, the goodness that God makes out of this doesn't undo and throw away so that we forget them and don't remember them, the things that went before. So I walk up and down the halls and I think these things. And they're all true, and I know I want to sit here and tell them to you when the time comes. But they don't reduce my sorrow. They don't lessen my pain. They just make it possible to carry it. This is the reality of the incarnation. This is what the incarnation really means. If you want to come sit in my living room or sit in a class with me someday, I'll explain to you all the philosophical parts about how it fits together and how it works. But that's just the explanation. The real meaning of the incarnation comes to you in a lonely hallway when your friends aren't around, and sometimes even your own mother doesn't recognize who you are. Amen.
Amen.